Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today I'll be reviewing Deception: Murder in Hong Kong. In this 4 to 12 player game, one person sitting around the table is secretly a murderer, and everybody else needs to figure out who it is and how they committed this murder. The catch is that one other person around the table knows who it is and how they did it, but the only way they can communicate that to the rest of the players is through silently giving clues on little player boards. First, I'll go over the way the game plays, and then I'll jump into my review. This is the starting setup for a 4-player game of Deception. Each player takes 4 murder weapons and 4 key pieces of evidence from the very large stacks. Like, these are all the pieces of evidence here. And there's a smaller but still substantial stack of murder weapons to choose from. You place all these cards face up in the middle of the table, and then each person gets an accusation token. And now, before we pass out the roll cards, each player looks at the various cards that are in front of them and the ones around the table. Once they're ready, it's time to pass out the hidden rolls. Now, in a standard game, you always need to have 1 forensic scientist, and you need to have 1 murderer, and then you put a number of investigators as you need to make up the total number of players. So in this case, it'd be 2 investigators, a forensic scientist, and a murderer. So you shuffle these up, and then you deal these out to the 4 players. Each player looks at their cards, and the one who has the forensic scientist immediately flips it over, and they actually ditch all the cards that are in their area because they're no longer a suspect. They actually are the person who's going to be trying to tell everybody else what's going on. At this point, the forensic scientist asks everyone to close their eyes, and then asks the murderer to open their eyes. In this case, it would be this player down here. And then the murderer silently points to 1 card from the top row, which in this case would be a murder weapon, and 1 card on the bottom row, which is a key piece of evidence. So for instance, they could point like right here, pointing to the wrench and the cotton. Once the forensic scientist nods that they get it, then the murderer closes their eyes, and then everybody else opens their eyes, and the game begins. The forensic scientist is on the same team as the investigators. They are trying to out the murderer, specifically the murder weapon and the key piece of evidence. And to do that, they have several boards. They always have this cause of death board, which has several different items on it. And then the next thing that they need to do is they pick one of these 4 location boards that has something on it that best matches perhaps either the key piece of evidence or the weapon. So perhaps they would pick this one right here because it has building site as an option, and they know they're trying to get people to crescent wrench. So they add this here, and then there is a very large stack of random clue tiles. They draw 4 of these, and they're going to add them to the table. So when they are all done, there are going to be 6 of these tiles that the forensic scientist is able to use to give clues. The forensic scientist is not allowed to say anything. All they do is they take one of these little bullet markers and they put it on one of the options for all of the boards that are in front of them. So for instance, they might take this one here and put it down to building site because they think that correlates pretty well with the wrench. And for cause of death, they have an interesting decision to make, right? Because they could go severe injury because getting hit over the head or somewhere with a wrench is going to be a severe injury, but they could also go with accident because if it's a building site, maybe the wrench just fell on somebody's head. But let's say in this case they go with severe injury over there. And there's no particular order that they put these tokens down in. In fact, the order they place them is a clue to the investigators, perhaps, which of the clues on the boards are stronger versus which are weaker. So now they look at corpse condition, and maybe they would just say intact because you're not going to be falling apart with the wrench. The victim's occupation, maybe they'll put worker, trying to tie it in with the building site. But remember, they also have to convince the investigators that cotton is an important thing as well. So looking at these different things here, like motive of the crime, that could potentially be really any of these. And so the forensic scientist might do that one last because it doesn't really affect anything. And same with the victim's build, although they could definitely go with fit if they're going for a worker. And then perhaps motive of the crime doesn't really matter. They'll just put jealousy down here. And they put this one last so they hope people don't look into it too much. And according to the rules, each player starts clockwise from the forensic scientist, and they have 30 seconds to make a case for various combinations that these could match up with. Right now, that would be actually the murderer, so they would be trying to lead the other investigators off their trail, potentially trying to point out that like a trowel could cause a severe injury, and you definitely use a trowel when you are at work, for instance. And they might also mention the machine with a work site. Like, there are different things that they might point out, and no other player is allowed to interrupt that player while they're talking. And then you move clockwise, and then each player does one of these for up to 30 seconds. Once everybody has had a chance to talk, that is the end of round 1. The forensic scientist is going to draw another random tile. They are going to get rid of one of the previous ones, one they think that does not really relate to the evidence at all. They'll flip this over, and now they'll add this piece of evidence to the overall system. So in this case, evidence left behind. Now they could try to point at the cotton. In this case, they would probably put natural down there. Once again, all players would have 30 seconds each to discuss their theories. And that would end the second round. So once again, the forensic scientist would try to get rid of the one that doesn't add them enough information. So they might get rid of this one. They'll draw another random one, victim's clothes. They'll add that in here. And now, once again, they're probably trying to point people to cotton because they have lots of good signals towards the wrench. So, I don't know, maybe they would go with neat, assuming that people understand that cotton clothes are neat. It's kind of hard to give that correlation, but they're doing the best they can. And then for one last time, each person gets 30 seconds to talk around the table. Now, there are these accusation badges, and each person gets only one of them. And once they do a formal accusation, they have to discard it, and they don't get another one in the game. And you can actually use these at any point in the game. You don't have to wait until the third round, although the later you go, the more information you're going to have. And when you make a formal accusation, you point to a single murder weapon and a single key piece of evidence in somebody else's area, and the only thing the forensic scientist can say is yes or no. And if they say no, that does not mean that this player is not the murderer. They just mean that was not the exact combination of items that were the murder weapon and key piece of evidence. And according to the rules, once you get to the final person, you're not allowed to interrupt them, and once they finish, nobody else is allowed to make a final guess. So this is a little peculiar. I guess it means that everybody needs to guess before the final person takes their turn to discuss the situation. If at any point somebody makes an accusation that's correct, they say wrench and cotton, then the forensic scientist says yes, and the game is over, and everybody but the murderer wins. If everybody uses their accusations and nobody has gotten the exact match, then the game ends and the murderer wins and everybody else loses. At this point, I'd like to talk about the 2 extra roles that come in the game. The rules say you can bring these in with 6 or more players. I've used them with 8 or more players. I think that's probably a better count for it. But anyway, the first one is the accomplice. When you shuffle this in, then the accomplice is on the same team as the murderer. The only difference is the accomplice does not point to any object. So when the forensic scientist says, murderer, open your eyes, they also say, accomplice, open their eyes. So the accomplice sees who the murderer is, they see what the actual items are that they pick, and the murderer sees who the accomplice is as well. And at the end of the game, if the murderer is not picked, then both the accomplice and the murderer win. So it allows the murderer to have somebody else on their tail trying to lead people astray. But if you're using the accomplice, you should probably also use the witness. So once the forensic scientist asks the murderer and the accomplice to close their eyes, then they ask the witness to open their eyes, and the forensic scientist points to the 2 people at the table that are the murderer and the accomplice, but they don't actually tell the witness who is the murderer and who is the accomplice. So the witness has a lot more information than everybody else because they can narrow it down to 2 people with whom the murderer could be. But the problem is that at the end of the game, if the murderer is caught, then the murderer and the accomplice can still win if they can point out who the witness is. So the witness needs to make sure they are not too obvious, because they could just throw the entire game if these 2 guys figure out that this person is a witness, then the game ends even though they were picked. I guess the idea is they kill the witness before the court case actually happens. And that's how you play Deception, Murder in Hong Kong. So now let's begin my review for Deception, Murder in Hong Kong, and we'll start with the positive points. The first of these relates to the forensic investigator role, and there are a couple different things that I like about it. The first thing has to do with the decision to kind of be playing one type of game or the other. Now, the way the rules are written, you're supposed to pass out all the roles randomly, and then someone will randomly become the forensic investigator. But what we found that we do is we pick somebody to be the forensic investigator first, and then deal out the rest of the roles randomly. And I know that is kind of a variant, I suppose, but it's really nice because there's usually someone at the table who really doesn't want the stress or risk or whatever of pulling up the card and seeing that they are the murderer in this game. And so you can just be like, okay, well, that person, you get to be the forensic investigator for this play. And spoiler alert, that's usually me. I have baggage when it comes to social deduction games. I get so stressed out, and I just really dislike being the person who is like the murderer or the spy or the werewolf or whatever, where they reveal that card and they realize they have to deceive and lie to their friends in order to play well, and I just really dislike that for the most part in social deduction games. Now, it's really not that bad as the murderer in this game, but that's a tangent. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's great having the option to get out of that and just know right from the beginning you're going to play this game with your friends. They're going to do that, who's lying, who's back and forth, and you don't have to worry about that. You're kind of above that game, looking down, trying to guide things, trying to tell everybody who the murderer is. You know what's going on, and you don't have that stress of potentially being the murderer. The other side about the forensic investigator is that it's just a mechanically interesting situation to be in. It feels kind of like Concept and Mysterium. It has that vibe where you have this puzzle in front of you, a bunch of different pieces of data, and you're trying to hone everybody else in on a very tiny subset of that data. And you have these really broad concepts and clues to get people there. You have to kind of triangulate from many different angles. And the fact that this game has so many tiles and you pull them out randomly adds a very interesting layer of strategy for that forensic investigator to figure out how they're going to get through these really not helpful tiles often, like what kind of clothing were they wearing? Well, they were poisoned, so they could be naked, they could be fully clothed, that doesn't have any effect. And so how are you going to best navigate and give the right clue to not pull people away from what you're trying to get at? So mechanically, it's just a really interesting thing that I love having in the game, and it's also great to have the option of just not potentially being the murderer, which I usually dislike. Positive number 2 relates to the really important decision that the murderer has to make right at the beginning of the game of which murder weapon do they choose and which key piece of evidence. In your average social deduction game, once you reveal that card and you're the werewolf or you're the spy, how well you play that game is strictly dependent on how well you can lie and deceive all the people around the table. But in this game, while you do have to do some deception, I mean, it is the name of the game, you will sink or swim based off of that decision that you make. You could pick a bad murder weapon and a bad piece of evidence and lose really fast. So you need to look around the table and find each of those things that will disguise themselves with the rest of them around the table. Like, you don't want to pick a food article when there is no other food around the table, and you don't want to pick a bludgeoning instrument if nothing else around the table could really kill somebody by hitting them over the head with it. So it's great that you have this important decision, and you might find yourself not needing to lie or deceive your friends very much at all in the game if you pick correctly, and I really like that addition to the game. Positive number 3 relates to the general atmosphere at the table that this game fosters. In many social deduction games that I've seen in the past, it gets to the point where there might be elevated voices and like arguments come into play as people are trying to, push the blame back and forth on each other. But in Deception, it almost feels like a fully cooperative game. Like, at certain points, you forget that somebody is actually deceiving you because the best way to play it is to be civil. Like, if you are the murderer and somebody looks over to you and they point to your murder weapon and your key piece of evidence and they have it right, and they say, I think this might be it because of this and that and the other thing, the best thing that you can do is say, oh, I hadn't thought about that. I guess that is a pretty good idea, but I think it's a stronger pick if you look over here, this and that. And that way you disguise yourself as an investigator. You don't get your hackles up. There's no increase of emotion. It's very analytical and calm, and I like that. It means that as the murderer, it's less stressful too, because I don't feel like I'm straight up lying to my friends. I don't feel like I'm trying to make connections that don't exist. What I'm trying to do is say, in an alternate reality, this and that really could be the solution to the game. Like, that person effectively could be the murderer. Now, you know that you are the murderer, but you can kind of have a split decision in your head, and it feels less stressful, and I like the general atmosphere that this game brings to the social deduction genre. Now let's talk about my one neutral point, which might be a bit of a nitpick, but from a graphical perspective, I found that there can be confusion as to which cards are the murder weapons and which cards are the key pieces of evidence. Sometimes it's obvious based off of what's on the card, but sometimes it isn't, and those key pieces of evidence could definitely feel like murder weapons, and that confusion has crept into a couple of the games I've played. One game was completely kind of lost because the forensic investigator got it mixed up, and this game is pretty short, so it's only like 15 minutes or so that is kind of ruined by that mistake, but I wish there was a little bit more emphasis in the graphical display on the cards to really hammer in which one is the evidence and which one is the murder weapon through maybe a big symbol in the top right corner, or just saying weapon and saying evidence or something like that on the card. It's not a huge deal, but it's something you definitely need to keep in mind and stay on top of, that it's sometimes pretty easy to get the two confused. So now let's go into my negative points, and the first of these relates to the information overload that can start to happen with higher player counts. The rules say that you always have 4 key pieces of evidence and 4 murder weapons that are in front of you, no matter how many people are playing. What that means is, in a 6-player game, there are going to be 40 cards on the table, but in a 10-player game, you're looking at 72 cards around the table, and that is just crazy, especially if you are the forensic investigator trying to give clues. And I mean, it's going to take you like 5 minutes just to read all the cards around the table and then double back and try to hone in. And then everybody else around the table, now they have such an incredible amount of information to parse that it gets really overwhelming when only 2 of those things are the answer to the game. And now I think this is why there are extra roles like the witness and the accomplice to kind of make that a little bit easier. But I really think that the rules should have had some stipulation, like once you get to 6 or 7 players, now you go down to 3 pieces of evidence and 3 pieces of murder weapons in front of you. And once you hit 10, maybe you have 2 and 2, or just less. To the point where I almost feel like house ruling it if I find myself in a situation to play it with a lot of people, because it does play well with a lot of people. except for that issue. So yeah, I just think they should have done a little bit more to make it less overloading when it comes to that. And negative number 2 relates to the kind of awkward way that the rules tell you that you need to do accusations, especially in the final round of the game. It says that once the final person gives their little talk about their 30 seconds about who they think did what, nobody else can accuse at that point. Only that one person, so it means that everybody is kind of incentivized to make accusations right before the last person, and it's just clunky and weird, and we've kind of thrown it out. Every time we play now, we just say, you know, once everybody has had their say, now we do the accusations, because it pretty much never makes sense to accuse anybody before that, because you may as well have more information. There's no penalty for making the game go longer as the investigators. So that's just a little weird. We've gotten to the point where we pretty much house rule that. We have another house rule that I talked about with the forensic investigator, and these things are not huge impacts on the game, but it's confusing the first time you read it, and you kind of read it over and over again. You're like, this doesn't make sense. And I think we decided not to play according to the rules before we ever actually played the game, because it was just kind of so weird and awkward. Alright, so now let's discuss the replayability of Deception, Murder in Hong Kong, and I think it's definitely above average. There are a ton of pieces of evidence and murder weapons in this game, to the point where, you know, every time you play, you're going to see a very different selection of all these cards in front of you, and there's a really big stack of the forensic investigator tiles that they randomly pull. So you're not going to feel like you're always, you know, having to figure out what kind of clothing the person was wearing, because you'll probably go several games before you get that tile again. So I think mechanically, what they have in the box, it has really long legs as far as replayability is concerned, just through the variety of the cards and the tiles and all that stuff. Also, the asymmetric kind of roles you can play, specifically if you decide to choose if you can be forensic investigator or not at the beginning of the game. That gives a different vibe. You could play the game twice in a night, and you essentially play 2 different games if you were the forensic investigator in one and not in the other. Alright, so now let's discuss the different player counts that Deception Murder in Hong Kong supports. And it's a lot of them, right? You go from 4 to 12. And I have played a 4-player game, and it was pretty underwhelming. Having one person as a forensic investigator and then 3 other people, one of whom is a murderer, it just doesn't feel like there's enough going on, enough really good interactions. It feels like the sweet spot for this game is the 6 to 8 range, because at that point you can start bringing in those other roles like the witness and the accomplice, and the game is fine without those, and the game plays okay at 5, but you really do add quite a bit to the game when you add those extra roles in. But as I mentioned before, once you start getting to that level of 7 to 8 people, there is just way too many cards around the table, to the point where I really do feel like I want to start house ruling down and just removing at least one, like having 3 pieces of evidence and 3 murder weapons in front of everybody if we're playing like an 8-player game again, because it's just way too much. And to that point, even if you start removing those pieces of evidence, I think 9 or more players is going to start to just get too long. That's just too many people who can talk for 20 to 30 seconds in each one of the rounds. Like, this game plays best when it's like 15-ish minutes, and you are going to get a 15 to 20 minute experience if you're playing with 8. But I think if you have 10 people, it's probably going to stretch on much longer than that. So I would not recommend that quite as much. I think 6 to 8 is a sweet spot. In conclusion, I've been pleasantly surprised by Deception. I went into it expecting to really dislike it, because I really dislike most social deduction games where you can randomly become a werewolf or a spy, and then I feel like I have to stress out and lie to all my friends. Oh, I just really dislike that. And this game gives a couple different alternate paths. I could be the forensic investigator as long as everybody else is okay with that. And even when I'm not the forensic investigator, if I reveal that I'm the murderer, it's just a lot less stressful than most other social deduction style games, because I feel like the decision of what cards to pick in front of me for the murder weapon and the key piece of evidence is a large piece of how well I will do in the game, and how I deceive my friends feels like soft lying. Like, you're postulating things that really could be truthful in an alternate universe where that person is actually the murderer. You actually, as the murderer, pretty much play as the investigator, just making ideas and trying to match up the cards around the table. The only difference between you and everybody else is you know what the combo is, and you just need to lead people to other combinations and try to convince them that those are stronger without losing a civil, nice atmosphere around the table. So I've enjoyed playing the game. It's a pretty good time, but I don't find myself going out of my way to play it pretty much ever. I don't think I will own the game at any point. The one I've been playing is a friend's copy, and when it gets played at game nights, somebody asks me if I want to play. Some nights I say yes, some nights I say no. I could see myself playing it quite off into the future. It's a good game. It's just not an amazing game for me, but what I can say is it's probably my favorite social deduction game, which is not saying a lot, but this is a pretty fun one. If you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and vlogs, please subscribe to my channel. Also, you can directly support the channel at patreon.com/JonGetsGames. Thanks for watching.